to him? Like, do you kind of have like a traveling show for your podcast, or like, how's that work?
Yeah. I mean, for the podcast, I started it 3 years ago when I was living in Virginia in my bedroom when I was 17. And for context, I'm 20 years old now. And, I live in LA now, and it's been a crazy journey, as we'll get into it. But the podcast has always been something that I started to make connections and to build relationships with high quality people. And it started off interviewing, good friends of mine, to the Larry Kings and Rick Rosses and the mayor of Miami. But something that I've always done that I think is incredible, and I like to share with people, is to just show up. And what I mean by that is something like the mayor of Miami, and I've done this for different people like Grant Cardone. I saw what was happening in Miami with the Miami tech scene and what was happening with him talking about Bitcoin and just this whole movement on Twitter. I was like, I want to interview him. And for me, like, in-person interviews are always 10 times better because you get to shake their hand and you get to see them and they get to see you, and the content is much more. But I think for a lot of people, the past year I've done hundreds of Zoom interviews, and it's still amazing and there's so much quality content. But for someone like the mayor of Miami, bigger guy, I wanted to go out there and sit down with him in person. So I reach out to his team, we start talking, and I'm like, hey, I'll be in Miami next Wednesday at 2:00. Let me know if that works for you. I was giving them some times. And they're like, perfect, 2:00 works for us. For me, this is really what happened. I have no plans to go to Miami, and I end up just I book a flight and I show up, right? So and I've done that dozens of times with different people. And, I've invested not only time, money, and effort into these podcasts, but it's something that I've been obsessed with since I was 17 when it comes to
You told them you were going to be in
that.
Miami, but you weren't planning on being in Miami. But when he said, yeah, this works, they were like, oh yeah, I'm just in Miami. That's pretty chill. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And it works too. And people have done that for me when it comes to people that want to fly out to LA or whatever it may be. I've told this story, and I think it's worked. It's genuine. It's authentic. And I think just showing up, like the mayor of Miami, I showed up, I had the studio, we talked for 20, 25 minutes. He was a busy guy, but he'll remember me now. We've had conversations on Twitter and Instagram, and he remembers me as the guy that popped up in the office, had my setup within 5 minutes, and boom.
Yeah, you have like a microphone. You have like a microphone, and like you have the stuff to set up a podcast like on the go. Yeah,
I mean, I use like the Rodecaster board, and same mic you have, the Shure 400, I believe it is, and I travel with it. Sometimes it's a pain, but it's a good portable setup to make it high quality.
So you're walking into the mayor's office and you're like plugging stuff in and like setting it up.
100%.
And dang, that's pretty cool. I actually wondered that, but I love that strategy. Like, you had some awesome guests on your podcast. Like I saw like Rick Ross, and he was smoking. He was like smoking a blunt on the podcast, right?
Yeah, on Zoom. Yep. It was epic.
I'm gonna be drinking a beer. I'm gonna be drinking a beer on this one.
I love it. Hey, I think the authenticity of something like that, even just like you bringing that up, is so important when it comes to interviews. And like, you see Joe Rogan smoke a joint with Elon Musk, and it's like the culture wants to see the authentic conversations that happen, right? Like I think the suit and tie interviews when everyone's trying to be so serious, sometimes like it doesn't come across as organic and authentic, So, I mean, with Rick Ross, he's smoking a blunt when we're doing an interview, and I'm like, do you, bro? Like, we're talking about business. This man owns hundreds of acres, and like he's about his wealth creation, right? So it's he's someone unique and different, but I mean, having him on the podcast was epic. And that's a whole other story about how I got him on with, he's one of his favorite authors is Robert Greene, who I know you love as well.
48 Laws of Power, baby.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. And I remember seeing, I'm good friends with Robert. He's spoken at one of my events and we've stayed connected. I've had him on the show, and sometimes he'll just call me or I'll call him and he'll just give me advice on girl or like my relationship or whatever it may be. But when I reached out to Rick Ross, I was like, hey, Rick Ross, I just had Robert Greene on the podcast. I see you just dropped your book. It'd be such a pleasure to have you on the show for 15 minutes. He's like, oh man, Robert was on the show. Like, I'm in. He's like, let's go. So like for people like that, like, and one thing that I want to point out too, is like all these different guests that I've booked, like they've all had different strategies, but it's came down to like, where can you find leverage, right? Like when I reach out to Rick Ross, my leverage point is I'm good friends with Robert Greene. But then on the back end, I've spent 4 years building a personal brand so that I can reach out to someone, they can see my track record, and it's an easier yes for them if they want to do it and if they're open to interviews. But, the podcast, world and my experience with it has been incredible. And just like from the relationships, like one thing that I always tell people, like in conversations, is my podcast is meant for three certain things. Number one, building relationships. Number two, deal flow. And number three, like right now I'm a partner in this company called MediaKits.com, and we're raising our pre-series right now, and we're raising just over $1 million. We're about to close on that. And that's came from me tapping into my network with people that know, like, and trust me, that have rapport with me, that have, some type of respect for me, and they're interested in learning more about what I'm building. And this, with Media Kits, it's been a recent project that has really allowed me to take a step back. That's awesome. Do what I want to do with this network and this show. And I think it's something that I always tell people I'll do for the rest of my life, because it's just the biggest networking hack when meeting people. Yeah.
I love it. I have like two thoughts from that. Like I think like, so the Rise of the Young, right? That's the name of your podcast, and you're young, you're 20. Like, is that part of your intentional strategy? Cause I feel like someone like Rick Ross or anyone really, they're like, all right, I want to connect to a younger audience. His podcast name's Rise of the Young. He's young. Like, was that intentional to name it Rise of the Young, to like basically be the voice for like young people, whatever that means?
Yeah, I mean, when I started the show, and the reason I named it Rise of the Young was like when I was 16, just getting into this whole personal development entrepreneur space. And, I got into it because when I was 15, I was injured playing football. I was in a neck brace for 6 months. I was almost paralyzed. And you're okay now, right? So, yeah, I'm good. I'm about to go snowboarding tomorrow. Like we're rolling. But it was during this time period when I was 16, I was, starting to study someone like Tony Robbins, and found out who Gary Vee was. And I'm going down this rabbit hole of just like immense knowledge. And I'm like, wow, my eyes are opening. Like, I haven't heard any of this type of information ever. And I started to see like this youth movement. One of my good friends, Caleb Maddox, he was 14 at the time. He's wrote 7 books, sold millions of dollars from stage. And I was like, wow, like there's so many young people that I'm just connecting with on social media that are really like making strides and that are motivated and ambitious. So, Rise of the Young just came to me, a simple phrase. I self-published a book back in 2017, just called Rise of the Young. I stuck with the title, and I was like, hey, I'll just name my podcast Rise of the Young to be the voice of the youth. And from the perspective of the youth, when I'm sitting down with these awesome people, but never in a million years did I think I'd be able to say like, hey, I was the youngest person to interview Larry King, and we have a 67. That was cute.
That was cute with you and Larry King, because it was like an old man and a young guy. It was like, oh, everyone loves that. Everyone loves that.
And it's so cool because like the way my brain works is like I think 50 years in advance. Where I'm like, wow, like it's gonna be so awesome for a 19-year-old in 2050 to look at that interview with Larry King and I and say, that 19-year-old kid was interviewing 87-year-old Larry King, who was an absolute legend that my parents' parents used to talk about, that still has stood the test of time. And for me, like hitting those milestones and having those great people on the show when I'm like 19, 20, 21, 22, and over these next couple of years is very important to me, because it allows me to look back on like that period of my life from 17 to 21. And I think for me, it captures attention from someone young that, maybe they say, wow, like, maybe I can do it too. And it breaks down the barriers of age, right? Like, am I too young to do something, or am I too early to get started? So that's where it comes from.
That inspires people. Like, is most of your audience young people?
It's usually it's like 18 to 35, but more recently it's been like the 25 to like 35.
Well, you're aging a little bit, so your audience is aging a little bit, right?
Yeah,
that's kind of how it works.
For sure.
That's awesome. Yeah. Like when you interview someone in person, because this is episode like 87, 88 of my podcast. I've had some good people on. I know David Meltzer, Patrick Bet David. I've had one in person, and like we didn't really have the audio set up well, but like I just bought this big building for my business, and we're gonna have some space in there to like set up a studio. And like, I definitely understand. Joe Rogan talks about it all the time. The value of like interviewing someone in person. There's just something special about it. And I get it. Like, do you like kind of hang out with like some of these people like before and after, like make a day out of it? I mean, I'm sure not with the middle of Miami. You're probably in and out.
For sure. Right? That's a phenomenal question too. And I think like these type of questions are what's very important for listeners, where like, for me, like, some of the best conversations that I've had with people in person happen before and after the interview, right? Like when you turn off the recording, you're like, wow, that was incredible. And, like, for example, I just interviewed the co-founder of Twitch, Justin Kahn, last week. And, they sold to Amazon for $970 million.
Dude, yeah.
For sure. And like he recently minted his YouTube videos as NFTs, which I'm sure you've heard about, this whole crazy world.
I'll talk about that a little,
So before we got into the podcast, I was asking him about his NFTs and, knowing that I wanted to talk about it on the show as well. Like, we were just chatting beforehand. He was talking about why he did it and we were just getting to know each other a little bit. And then we obviously did the podcast for 30 minutes. And then at the end of it, during the show, we're talking about startup investing and all this different types of stuff. I never like to take time during the interview to like pitch what I'm doing. Like I want to make it about the guest. But as soon as we ended the recording, I was like, hey, Justin, can I take 2-3 minutes of your time and screen share and show you what I'm building at Media Kids? He's like, go for it. He's like, the best time is now. It's best not that we set up a meeting. I'm a busy guy, but let's go for it. And, it showed me like, and I've done this a lot where take 5-10 minutes, screen share, show him what I'm building, tell him what I'm doing. And whether he just gives me advice or gives me a different perspective or wants to set up another meeting and potentially become an investor or whatever it may be, like those are the conversations that people don't see that I do. Right. And I think for me, like that's the most valuable part of this entire podcast ecosystem. If you have the right intention with it, right? Like I didn't interview Justin to pitch him, not at all. But I learned about his investment strategy. I learned about what he likes investing into. I learned about, he has a fund and all these different things. And I'm like, Justin, I'd love to show you this. And if he's open to it, and we just had a great conversation, he likes and trusts me now. He's down. So I think to your point, there's always great conversations that happen before and after the interviews. I mean, maybe a couple of times, I'd hang out with that person for a couple hours after if it's in person, but typically it's like even just the 5, 10, 15 minutes after if we're hanging out on a Zoom or whatever it may be, like that's the gold. And that's what I always try to bring up when people ask me that, because
that's interesting.
Those are the unspoken conversations that people don't see. And that's
interesting. All right. So like I have not done a good enough job of that because my business, like we sell clothing, we have an e-commerce company, United Monograms, is doing great. And I'm not necessarily like looking for investors or like have a product to pitch to like a successful person. And I'd like wonder like the value I could keep of like holding a relationship. I think it's so interesting that you called Robert Greene and talked to him about girls and talked to him about stuff like that. Like you definitely must have like had some intention of doing that, but like that's not recorded, right? That's like genuine kind of like friendship.
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
Like that's pretty cool. Like, and like you went golfing with David Meltzer. I saw that. Like,
yeah. And funny enough, this is actually hilarious and a fun fact. So my girlfriend, Jacqueline Burnett, I've known her
I always see you talking her up on your story stuff.
No,
it's sweet. I love it.
No, I appreciate that, man. And she's incredible. But fun fact for like everyone in this business community. So Dave Meltzer is her cousin. And I've known Dave for 3-4 years before Jacqueline and I started dating. He's been a mentor to me. He's spoken to my events. So like the synergies and the overlap was quite ironic, to be honest. But it was like nowadays it's like family. Like Dave just came on as an investor in Media Kids, and we just got him involved. So now he's a business partner, mentor. I guess you could consider him family in a sense, right? So and to your point though, it's like those are the things that are crazy, the way the world works and how it all unraveled with just something as simple as that. Like Dave is an incredible speaker. I've listened to his podcast for years.
Yeah, and, I had him on. I had him on the podcast. He was awesome.
Yeah. No, he's incredible. But it's funny because like going golfing with him is just like now a casual Saturday, right? Because I'm dating Jacqueline and that's her cousin, and it's just funny how the world works, Yeah,
it's kind of like a lifestyle thing too, because I don't really golf because I'm like kind of like a workaholic. I have like my business. We have machines and printers, and like that's like kind of my thing, like entrepreneurial. Like I never take a day off. Like a lot of people are like that, but like the value that you get from like hanging out with someone. I don't know. I've done it on the podcast a lot because it's been cool to talk to people, but I see how you do it pretty well. It's cool that you kind of take it out, and he's family, so it might be a little different.